Hi, guys. Before we start this episode, I have a question for you. Do you know there are two things that you should do to your garden this fall? You can find both of these items, links to them, and discount codes because let's face it, those are important at soulyrested.com/soil. The first thing you need to be putting your soil to bed with Mineralite soil amendments. They replenish what your soil has lost over the entire growing season, and they feed your soil microbes throughout the winter. So your soil and the microbes in it are ready for spring. The second thing you need to do is do a soil test. Don't wait until spring. Find out right now the ways that your soil needs repair and start those specific amendments now. By the way, the soil test is going to tell you exactly what you need to know. That's why this is the only soil test that I recommend. So, those amendments that you make will be able to take effect now and throughout the entire long winter. By the way, my extra tip while you're there, order two soil test kits so that you have one on hand to retest next summer and see how things are going. Go to soulyrested.com/soil and check out both of these. Welcome to the Simple Doesn't Mean Easy podcast. We are here every week working at simplifying things in our lives one day at a time, one simple step at a time. And I'm your host, Michelle Visser. Glad you're joining me. Today, we're talking about something that is not talked about enough for a backyard gardener or for somebody who's even just growing in a very small area, like a small raised bed. Um, this is a topic that I have put off talking about for a long time because I'm still learning about it. And there aren't resources out there to really make it clear. But I wanted to make a difference in that area. So I have a resource for you I'm going to be sharing with you, and we're going to talk through it in this episode. We are talking about cover crops for the home garden. Hold up, guys. Before we go any further, I've got to stop. I got to tell you, I'm giving away a dehydrator. Actually, not just one dehydrator. I'm giving away two dehydrators to two lucky winners. And it's super easy to enter both giveaways. So go enter both. And best of luck. Go to soulyrested.com/dehydrate, and there you will find everything you need to know how to enter this giveaway. They will both be for a very limited time, so don't hesitate. Just go right now. Pause this episode. I promise I'll be here when you get back. And go to soulyrested.com/dehydrate and enter to win both of those giveaways for a dehydrator. So go to the show notes, or if you're on YouTube, look at the description on the under the video, and there will be a link to the complete ultimate guide to cover crops for a small home garden. But we're going to work through it. And if you're more of an audio person, you don't even need to go look at the written article. But first of all, I want to say that this is not an end all be all to a perfect garden, but I have found that it's one of, I guess, three different steps. I just recently did a series of a three-step workshop that you can find on YouTube in a playlist. I'll link that in the description. Um, and the three different workshops broke down exactly what you need to know for three different things that I do to my garden every fall to get it ready for the winter. Well, one of them I don't do every fall, but if you haven't done it, I highly recommend it in the fall. And that is, I'll just tell you the three things. You can certainly go see the workshops where I go into more detail and I show you exactly how to do these things. But the first thing is a soil test. If you haven't done a soil test, I can't recommend it enough. Or if it's been a few years since you've done one, definitely do one because, especially certain minerals in the soil, can be highly impacted just even by a lot of rain on any given summer. So, your soil consistency and what it's made up of changes. It can change dramatically from year to year. So, get a soil test, find out what your soil is plentiful of, what it might have too much of, and what it might be lacking in. And all of those things can be easily and naturally amended. I love the soil tests that I recommend because they literally give you links to what you can do, what you can buy, what products you can use to naturally, sustainably amend your garden to get the soil to where it should be so that it is able to give you the most nutrient dense crops that you would ever imagine. This soil test is worth its weight in gold. It makes everything crystal clear. It is not for somebody with a PhD. It is for an average, everyday person like you and me who just wants to know, what do I need to do in my garden? It makes it clear. It doesn't give you mumbo jumbo, it breaks it down. So I'll link to that soil test and a discount code in the description, or you can go to solelyrested.com/soil, and everything that we're talking about today, including the cover crop information, will be linked there. So solelyrested.com/SOIL, soil, and make sure you take advantage of that discount code. I highly recommend you get a couple tests. I always tell people when they reach out and they ask me questions about it, I tell them whenever I order it, I order two because then you have on hand the next one that you're going to need to check on the results from what you've done to amend the soil. So, plus, then you pay no shipping. Bonus, I am always eager to find ways to pay no shipping charges. Yes? Okay. Second thing is a soil amendment. This also is from the same company. I link it, same discount code, all of it at solelyrested.com/soil. But this amendment is all natural. I went for decades of my gardening life using things that I really shouldn't have been using, that were depleting my soil more than they were helping it. They might have been helping the plants in that moment, but they were making my soil quality lessen. And I'm sad looking back that I didn't know. There are all natural ways to do this. There's no reason to garden in an unsustainable way. There just isn't. But this amendment is called Mineral Light from Redmond Ag. Again, make sure you get my special code to save on your purchase, but I can't recommend it enough. There's actually two choices. You can get it with manure or without manure. And it is literally giving a spark to your soil. It is giving food to the microbiome of your soil. And that is so important if you want to have nutrient dense food. You got to feed the microbes in your soil. It's not much different. In fact, it's not any different than our own gut health. If we don't feed the good organisms in our gut, we are going to have health problems. If we don't feed the good organisms in our soil, our plants are going to have problems and we are not going to have the end result that we want. Even if the tomato looks like a regular old tomato, it's not going to have the same nutrients as if our soil was healthy. So, those are the first two things. But today's episode is all about the third thing, which is cover crops. And this is something that's usually done on a large scale. It's been done probably forever on a large scale for agricultural farmers. But it gets really confusing when you look at doing it on a small scale. And I had questions I just could never answer. So I thought it was time that after years and years of working through this and finally biting the bullet and trying to plant some cover crops, it was 3 years ago, the first time I ever planted cover crops. And I did a lot of things wrong. Um, Heck, I probably did things wrong this year because I'm still learning, but I've learned a lot over the past 3 years. And I decided it was time that I make that resource that I wish I had 3 years ago. So, between this podcast episode, a YouTube video that I'm going to be doing that's showing the actual cover crops and how I um, use the whole process and work through it, and the ultimate guide that I've written, between all three of those things, I've put together the resources that I hope people out there are going to find when they are asking all those questions I asked that kept me from even trying cover crops because they're pretty amazing. They do so many good things for our soil. And actually, I actually forgot our sponsor, right? How many episodes was it ago? I don't think it's for this episode, but we had a sponsor for many weeks that was for cover crops. And I highly, highly recommend this company. Their cover crops have done amazing things for my soil. They have high quality seed and definitely go check them out at solelyrested.com/soil. Even though this episode isn't sponsored by them, it pretty much should be, guys. um, and I just went on a rabbit trail. What was I going to tell you? The reasons to plant cover crops. For one thing, if you have troubles with erosion, the roots of the plant of the cover crop are going to keep your soil in place. Pretty important. Otherwise, you wind up with all these rocks and exposed things, and your soil, the good stuff, washes away. Cover crops keep that from happening. They return nutrients to the soil, and we're going to talk about how that is. Depending on how you terminate the cover crop, there's different ways that it's giving nutrients to your soil. Um, if you let them go to bloom, which I never do, we'll get into why. But if you do, if you have an area of a garden that you're going to let go fallow for a year and you plant it with cover crops, the blooms are going to attract, of course, all the important pollinators that your garden is going to need. And there's lots more reasons. My brain just went blank. I knew I should have had notes in front of me for this. I do have notes in front of me for a few other things, so I don't forget. Um, but Oh, the other thing that I really like about cover crops is it gets me it keeps me on schedule. I'm a person that I tend to not want to let go of a certain season, and I say that allegorically, like a certain season of something in my life that I'm enjoying, I don't want to let go of it. I'm that way with my garden. Even though summer has gone, I tend to want to hold on to the garden and I just let it go and go and go. And the bad thing about that is there's often disease that builds up. And if you had any kind of fungus at all that got worse as the summer went on, it's only going to be worse if you let it go into the fall. And you don't want that fungus to sit there and it rain, maybe even snow on it eventually. And that fungus just goes deep into your soil and all the disease and the problems that come with it. So, the great thing about cover crops for me, if you're a person like me, is it keeps you on a schedule. It keeps you moving. It keeps you realizing, okay, if I want to get that cover crop in that's going to do great things for my soil, I need to get the old plants out that aren't producing anymore. I need to clear it, get the soil ready for the cover crops. So it seems like a silly reason, but actually it's one reason I love it. Another thing that seems silly, but I love is that it's really, really pretty. Instead of just having brown yuck that you're looking at until the first snowfall, you have gorgeous green. And I have patches of all different green because I like planting different cover crops in different sections. So it's kind of like when you're flying in the plane and you look down and you see all those gorgeous big squares of color when you're over farm fields. It's kind of like that on a tiny scale in my garden, and it makes me happy. So, those last two reasons aren't ones you're going to find in any official document as to why to plant cover crops, but they're important to me. So, basically, I wanted to break down because there are thousands of choices that you have for what you could buy for cover crop seeds. And I wanted to break it down into a more manageable thing to get my head around. So I decided to make it into three categories. A lot of places will show you categories when you're looking up cover crops. And they're called different things and they break them down differently. But for my purposes, I made three categories. And I will tell you that there are some cover crops that don't really fall into any of these, but it's not a big number, and I think it's worth it to minimize what my brain has to think about to start just making some categories and going with it. So there's legumes, which are the beans and the peas, and clover. I did not know before I started researching cover crops. Clover is a legume, and it is my favorite one to use for a cover crop. Then the second category is grasses, like, your wheats and your rye and your grass. And brassicas are the third one, like your broccoli, your kale, all of that good stuff, the radishes. So each category has different things that it really shines at helping with in your soil. And I decided to make a chart for this. So if you go to solirest.com/soil, you can have a link to find this information to get to this chart. Um, I broke down the important reasons that most people want to have cover crops. And then I made not three charts, three columns for the legumes, grasses, and brassicas, and noted which of those types of cover crops do the best job at the different reasons that we are planting cover crops. So essentially, there's five reasons on my chart. Two of the ones I just gave you are not on the chart. Adding nitrogen. Nitrogen is probably the biggest culprit for bad soil. And it's also the thing that probably changes the most because, like I told you, when there's a lot of rainfall or erosion, that greatly impacts the nitrogen levels. And if your nitrogen levels are off, it gets to a point that your plants can't even absorb nutrients from the soil. It can get that bad. So, Nitrogen is a really important reason that people are looking at cover crops. Also, nutrients. Cover crops are going to add nutrients that are often depleted from your soil. Hay or mulch. If you have a small farm, hay can come in really handy that you can be growing your cover crops for two reasons: to help your soil and to have food in the spring to feed to your animals. Or most backyard gardeners don't really have farm animals, but the plant material comes in really handy as mulch the following year that you can use to put around your seedlings to keep the weeds at bay and to keep the moisture in the soil. So, again, dual purpose there. As I already mentioned, cover crops can help with erosion, but one tends to shine, helping a little better than others. Um, and finally, aerating the soil. I don't think, did I mention that? Sometimes soil can be very compact. I have pretty compact soil. And if it gets too compact, you have problems. Your plant roots can't thrive and your worms can't thrive. So aerating the soil is a really important thing to get the oxygen in and to allow room for your microorganisms, et cetera. So um, there is one group that shines in that too. So on the chart, it breaks it down well. If you're a visual person, definitely go check out this chart. But essentially, only one of those categories are going to help you with nitrogen, and that's the legumes. Two of the categories are better than the other at nutrients. The grasses and the brassicas are better at feeding nutrients than the legumes, but the brassicas kind of shine in that area. So they get an extra kind of star on the chart. For haying and mulching, typically you want to stick with your legumes or your grasses, but again, the grasses shine in that area. For erosion help, the grasses are probably your best bet. If that's the main thing you're looking to battle, you probably want to go with the grasses category. And finally, for aerating your soil, grasses will help with that, but the brassicas are going to be the ones that shine. You get yourself a bed full of um, crop cover crops of radishes, and your soil is going to thrive with aeration. So the brassicas are the ones for that. So once you figure out which of those things are most important to you, that's one really great way to decide which cover crops you want to plant. Another thing to consider is, well, you know what? I think we're probably going to break this into two episodes because I don't want this episode to be too awfully long. I want it to be very manageable. So, in the next episode, we'll talk specifically about how you terminate those cover crops. And sometimes that's going to be the way you choose your cover crop because there might be a certain way you want to terminate it or, kill it in the spring before you plant your gardens. And depending on how you want to terminate it, there are better cover crops than others for doing it. In fact, one way of terminating, you have to choose certain cover crops if you want to do that. So we'll get into that the next episode next week. Um, for now, I want to stick with explaining more about each of these groups, and I want to explain more also that when you have a small backyard garden, I think the biggest obstacle to the idea of cover crops, especially if you have a short growing season like we do here in New England, is you can't get your head around, well, how do I do this and still grow food? Because it's basically two crops you're growing. You're growing your food crop and you're growing your cover crop. And there isn't enough time in my growing season to do both, right? So the biggest aha thing for me that really got me over that obstacle was to realize I can do this in patches, which is why I have that patchwork beautifulness of green right now in my garden. As soon as something starts to die out, instantly I take it out and I plant my cover crop. Where it used to be that I would have an empty space there and I'd move some of my container pots around so my herbs are pretty in that empty space, or I'd bring in some chairs. Like that was fine. It was kind of fun. It looked pretty. But I had all that space that just pretty much wasn't being used at all and it wasn't being nourished at all. If something died pretty early on in my growing season, the space just sat there, which now I look at that and go, how silly of me. I wish I had known about cover crops. So if anything doesn't do well, it comes out. And if you guys have been gardening for any length of time, unless you have a green thumb like I've never had, there's always a problem. There's always something every year that just doesn't do well. And instead of being discouraged about it, and every time I go in the garden, I'm kind of, oh, and I tend to leave whatever that crop is there and go, maybe it'll come back. Maybe it'll start thriving. But I know darn well it won't because it's like half dead. Instead of that, it makes me feel really good to have a plan, to be proactive and to go, that's it. It's out. It's not doing well this year. I don't know why. Or maybe a lot of times it's because a predator has gotten in. For us, it's chipmunks. And one year I planted my brassicas twice. Almost all of my broccolis, that stinking chipmunk ate every single one of them, like a couple every night. And I put out the mouse traps and I did everything I could to barricade the garden, but he still kept getting in. It happens. It just happens. So that whole area where I had all my broccoli planned for was just barren that year. And it would have been a great place for me to plant my cover crops. And I could have gotten those in. Shoo, I could have probably gotten those in by mid-June, because at that point, it's too late for me to plant more. Maybe not for the broccoli. I probably could have still planted mid-June. Maybe it would have been early July before I gave up entirely. Or maybe I just, I wouldn't have planted them because I did it twice and I went out and bought more. I grew some from seedlings. The chipmunk ate them. And then I went out and bought a whole new set of broccoli that year. And the chipmunk got to them too. So I would not have gone out a third time and bought more. I just wouldn't have. So yeah, I could have got the cover crops in mid-June and they would have done beautifully. They would have gotten to great maturity before the cold weather hit. Um, so anyway, all that to say, do it in patches. Any little bit that something dies, plant a cover crop, even if it's just a small little square. Instead of keeping the crops that aren't doing well, looking at them every day and getting frustrated by it, plant cover crops and enjoy the cover crops. And it looks nice and your soil is going to be happy. So, as far as these three different categories, let me look at this is where I have my notes. Let's go. Let's start with brassicas as a cover crop. I've listed three things about each cover crop. First of all, the benefits of that cover crop. Second of all, what's my favorite choice in this category, which maybe, doesn't really matter. There are so many choices, but I thought it would help to know my favorite choice. Maybe that would help you if you're not sure which one to choose. And third, just some facts about this category of cover crops that I thought you might like to know. And then that'll be it for today's episode. And join me next week, and we'll talk all about the many ways that you can terminate the crops and how that works and how to choose which way. So, for brassicas, the benefits they add nutrients to your soil. This, by the way, they all do all of these things. But again, this is the areas that the cover crop shines. They add nutrients to your soil, and they're excellent at aerating the soil that is really compact. My favorite cover crop in this category is a mustard mix. You could use any mustard. Did you know mustard is brassica, by the way? I learned that a few years ago too. But I particularly like this mix that I use because it has a nice assortment, which the more variety you have, I feel like the more nutrient variety you're getting. So I do link that mustard mix in my guide to cover crops. So just go to solelyrested.com/soil and you'll find it. Um, but I also really like leaving my kale, my broccoli, my Brussels sprouts. I leave them in the garden until usually after Thanksgiving. And they've been serving double duty that whole time. They're still producing food for our family because they're a cold weather crop, but they're also digging those roots into the soil and keeping the soil well aerated. And actually, it's kind of triple duty because they're keeping other things from growing there. They're keeping the weeds at bay all the way through until Thanksgiving or Christmas, when I sometimes will take them out and sometimes not. Sometimes I'll leave them until spring. If we still have pigs around, it depends on when the butchering time is. But if I take them out when there's still pigs around, I will take them out and feed them to the pigs, and then they've done quadruple duty, right? Because the pigs love the food. If I do keep them until spring, I might um, terminate them in one of the ways that I'm going to tell you next episode and let them rot up and decay into the soil, again, to give the nutrients into the soil. Okay, things to know about the brassica cover crops. This group germinates really quickly, which is another reason I love the mustard mix that I use. And that's especially important, of course, if you have a short growing season, like we mentioned. This group also does a really nice job of keeping weeds at bay. And it's easy to turn into the soil in the spring, and that gives you the best nutrient benefits. Often, this group of cover crops is used for animal foraging. So, large scale farmers might plant kale and radish and turnips for their cows or their pigs to forage in a dormant field that they're not going to be planting that year, but they're putting the animals into. They might plant that crop early on, let it mature, then put the animals in and let the animals forage from it while the roots of the brassicas are helping the soil as well. Brassicas are also a great cover crop if you have backyard chickens as well. In the same way, the chickens love the greens of those cover crops that grow above the ground, of course. So you can let the chickens in to eat them, or you could terminate them, feed them to the chickens, and leave the bottom part underneath the ground to keep breaking up the soil or to keep it broken up. Um, our family runs a pig farm, you probably know. So, one plant that I really love to grow for our pigs actually isn't a brassica, it's a perennial herb, but it kind of fits this category while we're talking about it that I treat it kind of like an annual cover crop in the sense that I plant it in different sections every year and I want to rotate where those chicory roots are growing every year. So they're doing their job like a cover crop, but the top portion is actually going to be food for our animals. And then the root part, when it's time to harvest it come fall, actually becomes tea for me. So it's kind of a cover crop, kind of not. That's the thing. Cover crops, like everything you do in your garden, there's a lot of overlapping and there's a lot of multiple advantages or disadvantages to choices that you make. So, um, oh, by the way, mustard is also something that backyard chickens love to snack on in the spring after the cover crops have grown all fall and all winter. So, no matter what brassica cover crop you choose, they are known for their extensive roots. They can go down up to 6 feet deep, some brassicas. So, whether the top is something you're using in another way or not, the roots are going to do a great job of aerating your soil. So, next is grasses. What is the benefit of grasses as a cover crop? They are kind of a jack of all trades. While big scale gardeners will use grasses for animal feed as soon as it reaches maturity, a small scale gardener can harvest the grasses as a green manure or a mulch for next summer's garden. But legumes are also excellent at this, and the quality of your soil is really what's going to help you decide if you want to go with a legume or a grass for that green mulch. Note that on my chart, I explained that the grasses get the star of distinction as a mulch because it's the type of hay-like mulch that most that we're most familiar with. If nitrogen fixation is something you need in your soil, though, you definitely want to go with legumes and use them as a mulch because they can do both. I I think I'm being really confusing. I'm sorry. Like I said, it's not an easy cut and dry, everything fits into one box kind of thing. There's a lot of overlap with all of these. But moving on to legumes as a cover crop, what's the benefit of them? They shine for a very important reason. They fix the nitrogen deficiency that's a very common problem in a lot of backyard gardens. Remember, if you don't know if you have a nitrogen deficiency, definitely do a soil test and find out. Reasons, I think we've already covered it though. Reasons that your nitrogen might be really low. It might be washed away because of erosion. It might be depleted because of the certain plants that you've grown in that part of your garden before. Um, Also, if you naturally have sandy soil, you're going to be fighting a nitrogen problem. And if you've done a lot of watering, so even if it wasn't a rainy season, but because of that, you needed to water a lot, or if you have a natural irrigation system set up, which is great because it saves you so much time, but a lot of watering is going to wash away the nitrogen in the soil. So, a lot of really common reasons that people have a nitrogen deficiency. And if you do have a nitrogen deficiency, Honestly, the best thing you can do is plant legumes as a cover crop. In fact, it's kind of a really neat way that it works, and it's not super easy to explain. And I see that we're getting to our half hour mark for the episode. So I'm going to include in our next episode next week, where we talk about all the ways you terminate your cover crops. We're going to start off by talking about how this nitrogen fixation works with legumes because it's fascinating. And there's something you need to know before you plant your legume seeds if you want to correct the nitrogen. There's a very important step you need to know about. So we're going to cover that in the next episode. My favorite cover crop in this category, hands down, mammoth clover. Red clover is a good one too. The mammoth clover, though, is a great multi purpose cover crop because it will get taller and provide more of that mulch material, that green mulch material for you the following spring. And clover is very cold hardy. So that's really important to me. It's a very durable crop that actually can grow even in the cold temperatures of the winter. So it's a great one here in New England, the mammoth clover. And things to know about this cover crop. Um, I think, yeah. Okay, there are a few things. I was going to say, I think maybe I'll just wait till next episode, but no, there's a few things I'll tell you. They're known for their excellent nitrogen fixation, unlike grasses and grains that will store nitrogen in the plant. The legumes are actually excellent at capturing nitrogen from the air and putting it into your soil. But it's not the plants that are doing it, it's that other symbiotic relationship that only works with legumes that I'm going to tell you about next episode. Um, Another thing is if you do have farm animals, you can harvest the legume crop for a really high quality animal feed. And legumes will give you that green manure. And in the end, legumes have proven to be my personal favorite cover crop. Um, on my chart, they actually don't get a plus sign or a star for anything. But that's really deceiving when you glance at the chart because it's kind of funny. They look like they're the least assuming option of the 3, but they shine so much at the nitrogen fixation, and they do all the other things well, and they're so, so hardy that they actually win the award of my favorite cover crop group. If I had to choose only one, which I don't, I do use a multiple assortment of them, but the legumes are my favorite. So that is it for today. And like I said, I don't want to make it too overwhelming and I don't want to be too confusing. So I'm going to keep it at that. I think that's enough information about cover crops for today. And please join me next week. We will go into really overcoming that biggest obstacle for all of us that have ever thought about cover crops. We're going to go into it and you are going to walk away going, "Oh, I get it. Oh, it's simple. Why did it not seem simple?" So please join me for that because you're going to be a cover crop expert after our next episode. So that's it. Thanks for listening, friends. Remember, it is easy to forget how blessed we are to live this life. So enjoy the simple, everyday efforts. It's not easy, but it is a good life.